Good evening. We've got quite a few people still joining, so I'll just give them another half a minute or so. Okay, we'll make a start. So good evening all. Hope you're all keeping safe and well at the moment. My name's Emily Boyce and I'm the Knowledge Exchange Manager for the North region in the AHDB Pork team, and I'll be facilitating this evening's meeting. Tonight we're going to be looking into weaner management with Christina Diamond. So just to start with, we've got a little bit of housekeeping. So first off, all participants are on mute and you're unable to communicate verbally through onto the webinar, but you are able to ask questions, and we'll go through that a little bit later. So today's session is running for an hour, just over an hour. We're starting at 7 and ending at the latest of 8:30 if we have quite a few questions coming through. The webinar is being recorded, so anybody who's registered will receive a link in a follow-up email 24 to 48 hours after we've finished. It will also be available on various online platforms, so you've got the AHDB website, the YouTube channel, and it will also be going over to the BPA website. So please don't worry about taking too many notes because you will be able to refer back to it. So for those of you that are signed up to the online training record, Pig Pro, you're able to log your attendance on there. And then we will be taking questions throughout. So please, if anything pops to mind, just pop it in the question box, which I'll go through in a second. We've got allocated time at the end to go through them, and anything that's not been answered, then we will get back in contact with you and get those to you. So when it comes to asking a question, if you have any problems with audio or visual, then do flag it to us through the question box as well. So as you can see, step 1 shows these are steps to show how to do it on a laptop, not on a phone, but it's very similar. Click on the arrow in the orange box there to pop out your control panel, and then step 2 is to go to the questions tab, type your answer in, and then click send. On a phone, it is a question mark button that should bring up the chat for you, and then other attendees will not be able to see your questions, so it'll only be us. As I say, I'll ask them all at the end, and if we don't get to any, then we will come back to you afterwards. And if you have any questions after the event, because we know this can happen as well, then we will go over to how to send these at the end. Just also as well, obviously working from home, we all have dogs, so if there is any barking, then we apologise. Hopefully that won't be the case. So the team tonight, we won't be sharing any of our cameras this evening, so we thought it'd be quite good to have a visual. So Christina is going to be doing the talk. There's me, and then we've also got Pippa on the call, who is in the background helping to run the show. So Christina, over to you.
Hi there, my name is Christina. I'm one of the vets at Farm Vet. Hopefully you can all hear me. If not, then let us know now. Okay. So I've been with Farm Vet for about 1 year, and been a pig vet for about 3 years. So hopefully we'll have some knowledge to impart to you. Today the session is on principle of weaning and establishing the weaner. So firstly, we need to talk about what weaning is. So weaning is when a young animal stops feeding from its mother's milk and instead starts eating food, especially solid food. Naturally, this would gradually occur over time, and for piglets until about 3 weeks of age in the wild, they would be solely relying on their sow's milk for all of their needs. And then as they grow older from there, they would start foraging for themselves and gradually would become less reliant on the sow milk for all the nutrients. Generally, natural weaning would be complete by about 9 to 10 weeks of age. So according to EU law, which we currently still have to follow, we should not be removing any piglets from the sows any younger than 28 days of age. So that's around 4 weeks. Piglets can, however, be weaned as young as 21 days if there has been a veterinary derogation for welfare reasons. This, for example, would include sow injury, sow disease, piglets starving, or potential sow death. These piglets would then have to be housed in specialist accommodation, which should be run as all-in, all-out rooms, and should be cleaned and disinfected between batches. Routine weaning of piglets younger than 21 days, however, would be illegal. So, the objective of weaner management. So for all you guys managing your weaners, we would want to achieve a smooth transition from a suckling pig to a weaner. And that means getting pigs to eat quickly post-weaning, hopefully achieving good growth rates and feed conversion rates as a result, achieving low mortality in this time and low dependence on antibiotic medication in achieving this low mortality, production of as uniform pigs as we can get, so nice even growth, low incidences of bite, including tail biting, ear biting, flank biting, good pig welfare generally, and overall, hopefully, profitability for your units. So what is happening to the piglet at weaning? So we are actually separating the piglets physically from their mother. This in itself, as you can imagine, presents a significant degree of stress, as you're actually physically removing that maternal body from them. You're then also removing their main food source, of course, which until then has been the sow's milk. They then move to a new environment, which in itself, again, is stressful. The food source tends to be different, i.e. often solid food. And it also is in a different place from where it has been in the farrowing crate or the farrowing house or the farrowing stall. The water source is also likely to be different. Sometimes this is when they're introduced to different types of nipple drinkers. And the drinkers are often again in a different place. Equally, the temperature of a weaner accommodation, whether it be straw or even a specialist weaner accommodation on slats, is likely to be different to the farrowing house originally. And the lying areas might not be as clearly defined. For example, in the farrowing house, we may have a creep area with a creep lid, but in our weaner accommodation, we may not have that. So having things like kennels may be the answer there. And often new stock people look after the weaners. So if you have a different stock person for farrowing compared to weaner, that presents potential stress for the piglet who's got used to that particular or those particular stock people. Often the pigs are also mixed at this point with other piglets, so meeting piglets from different litters, and therefore they often have to establish new hierarchies, which again presents a stressor. They can often be vaccinated either at weaning or just before weaning. If using a needle, this can be associated with pain and inflammation. But even if using needleless guns, the vaccination itself would result in a handling of the pigs, which may be new to them and can be stressful. Equally, they also have maternally derived antibodies while they're on the sow, having fed from the colostrum, and these are often lost roughly at the time of weaning. So talking a little bit more about the immune status of the young pig and maternally derived antibodies, so that everyone understands what I'm on about. So maternally derived antibodies are what we would call the antibodies that the piglets get from the colostrum, which is consumed by the piglets from the sow in the first 24 hours of life, hopefully. These are absorbed through the piglet's gut and into the bloodstream and act as their overall immune protection in this time. There are also additional antibodies within the sow milk, which is continuously supplied to the piglets. These antibodies act at a local level within the gut and try to help prevent the scour in the piglets. At weaning, we lose the antibodies that are being continuously supplied to the piglets in the milk, so they no longer have so much local protection in the gut. And also, as you can see from the graph, the actual passive immunity, so the maternally derived antibody is rapidly decreasing during the time that we are weaning. And they're not yet mature enough to be making their own antibodies in this time. So as you can see, between 3 and 5 weeks, we have quite a low immune protection of the piglet. So this combined with the fact that the weaner sheds, which even though they're hopefully cleaned and disinfected between batches, will likely be harbouring new, different bugs compared to the farrowing area, the piglets are often exposed to new diseases and have little protection against them. So, therefore, the impact of weaning stressors are simply that we have a reduction in feed intake, often reduced growth, worse feed efficiency as a result, sadly often poorer health, and therefore generally increased costs. As a result, we need to think about these weaning stressors and mitigate them as much as possible to help increase profitability and welfare of these piglets. So, limiting the stressors. So one of the first things we can do to limit the stress around weaning is to ensure there are as few bugs within the weaning shed as possible by proper cleaning and disinfecting. The principle is fairly simple. In the same way that we would not want to bring a newborn human baby into a really dirty environment for fear of illness, we would not want to be doing the same with our small weaners. Everything should be cleaned and disinfected between batches or between litters if you're a smallholder, and this hopefully would include water lines or the areas. We need to remove all organic material particularly first. This would mean mucking out all the sheds. So by organic material, the main type of organic material we generally have in these sheds is pig muck, and this can actually inactivate any disinfectant that you use. So mucking out would be our first step. Then we want to be soaking the sheds in a detergent, or which should be a degreaser as well, and we should allow it to soak. Then hopefully we'll be able to wash the shed with a proper pressure washer and wash away the detergent. Then we should be using a disinfectant. This should hopefully be a DEFRA approved disinfectant and should be used at the correct dilution as described on the bottle. And then we need to give the shed or the pen a time to dry. Drying time is extremely important and often overlooked. Drying will ensure that the disinfectant works and that the piglets are not being housed straight in a wet shed. So the lying in the wet would usually cause trilling, and we want to try and avoid that as much as possible for weaners. The next thing we can think about to try and limit the stress is what we do around grouping and mixing pigs post-weaning. So historically, we would be weaning into litter groups, and some of you may still be doing that. If you are able to do that, that's brilliant, as that's going to be the least stressful thing to do. However, for the slightly larger producer, this may not be economically possible, or you may not have the space, or it may be a problem with labour. So instead, we need to think about how else we can group. Ideally, we'd be grouping by size. So, and most ideally, we would have 3 groups: smalls, mediums, and larges. This is most often done now and helps to reduce competition at feeders and drinkers, and generally as they're more even, we have a better sorting out of the hierarchy quicker. Some people do still split by sex, but sexing alone tends not to be as effective for competition as grouping by size. Generally, people now, if sexing, are most often done to try and reduce riding later on. So you can sex and group by size as well, but grouping by size would be my preferential way to group. If weaning different ages, then we should also be thinking about grouping by age. The pigs must crucially be stocked correctly for the size of the pen, so not understocked or overstocked. So, talking about stocking density, we have a couple of tables here. As you can see by the first table, stocking rate itself has a direct effect on feed intakes and growth rates. So the higher you stock here, the lower the growth rates. The lower table on this slide shows the stocking densities recommended for the weights of pigs. So for weaners, this is 0.15 meters squared of unobstructed floor space. And when we say unobstructed floor space, we do mean exactly that. So you have to take out the space taken up by hoppers, feed troughs, or any drinkers which are on the floor taking up space. So that's the space that they need. So correct stocking rates are required to ensure good access to feed and water. So overstocking, like in the top picture, can lead to stress and fighting, increased vice, increased competition for resources. So as you can see, they're going to really struggle. All the pigs at the back are going to really struggle to make their way to go to these round feeders and to the drinkers which are in the round feeders, and therefore probably will result in poorer feed intakes for those pigs and slower growth. And you'll probably see those pigs growing apart, so having a real variation in size in the pen again, even though we've sized into the pens. So that's not something that we really would want. However, understocking, on the other hand, can cause temperature and ventilation issues within the sheds. This most often results in the pigs being too cold and causes them to huddle together. This in turn would mean they're less likely to go and eat and drink. If they found a nice warm spot huddled with their pen mates, they are unlikely to get up and walk to the cold area where the feeder or the drinker is. And therefore, we often see reduced feed intake here also. But, they also, if they're cold, use their energy to stay warm rather than for growth. So as a result, we tend to see poorer feed conversion in those instances as well. Both under and overstocking may lead to increased health problems, including scours, which is the same as diarrhea or pneumonia. So, what can be done in the farrowing area to ensure we get a better quality piglet at weaning? So, it's really important. Having good quality piglets weaned is often half the battle for weaner management. And it makes the weaner process a lot easier if we have better quality pigs which are more robust and can withstand more of the stresses that we've talked about. So the farrowing house needs to be considered always. So we need to make sure that we're weaning pigs at the right age. As we said, no younger than 21 days if you have a derogation, but no longer than 28 days if you don't. Ideally a little older, so the older we're likely to wean, the better the wean weight and the more robust the pig is likely to be. So probably as old as you can get them economically to make it worthwhile. We also want pigs that are of good weaning weight themselves, pigs that have had a good creep intake previously in the farrowing area. So both of these go sort of hand in hand. A good weaning weight and a good creep intake often do go hand in hand. Weaning weight you might also want to think about fostering, milk supply, and any extra you can put into there. That sort of relates to good stock person skills. We want pigs which have developed a gut for solid feed. Again, this interlinks with having had creep feed previously, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. We want to wean as healthy pigs as possible, so that includes having them being treated in the farrowing house if there has been a problem, and given vaccinations in the farrowing house so that they are protected against diseases such as porcine circovirus, etc., that they might encounter in the weaning period. So we'll just move on to some feeding. So feeding weaners correctly is very important. So the weaner period is where we will spend the most money on, well, one of the most money on feed generally, as the feed that we feed our piglets at this time is the most expensive feed. Starters, the creep and the link diets are just the more expensive feeds overall, even though they're not eating as much. We therefore need to manage the feeding very carefully so that we gain maximum feed conversion during this time. So generally, of all the stages of growth, weaners have the best feed conversion, hence why we want to feed them the better diets and maximise that conversion. This requires adequate feeding space. So we need to allow at least 10 centimetres trough space per pig in the first 7 days post-weaning. We should be hopefully feeding some gruel early on. So this is meal mixed in water or crushed pellets mixed in water. And ideally we should be feeding this again 3 to 4 times a day for the first 5 to 7 days at least. This generally helps increase feed intake for those piglets because it provides a better transition from the milk to solid feed. So it's sort of an in-between house between the two. Using long troughs or round hoppers allows piglets to feed together. This is good as when they were suckling, they would all be feeding together at once. So when the sows cool them, you can see that they all flock to her udder line. And again, this would be a similar, experience at the weaner shed. So it's less of a stress. So if we have the long troughs of the round feeders, they are able to do that. And overall, if we use these troughs, we see a better intake again. Then we need to think about feed availability. So for me, I always say I prefer them to be the feed to always be available so that they are on ad lib feed or at least very, very frequent feeds. Because if you think about it, when they're in the farrowing house, sow's milk is always available. They're always able to go throughout the day for little feeds. And they still have small stomachs at this time, so they need to feed little or not. However, if you're having to feed a ration feed, we want to definitely ensure that you have more than adequate space for them all to feed at the same time so that you're not having that competition and you're not having some of them being pushed out and again having that variation in growth as a result. It was really important to ensure all the piglets can reach the feed easily. That means checking that the hoppers are low enough or the troughs are low enough for even the smallest piglets in the pen to reach easily and not for them to have to get into the actual trough to feed, because obviously that effort is not going to be taken as often as we would want for a good growth. If they're on ad lib, again, we want to ensure they have enough space so that they're not queuing for feed and not having to wait. And ideally, we'd be measuring or recording our feed intake, especially in the first week, because in the first week of weaning, the intakes or any intake drops are really a first key indicator of a problem with them, which is often a health problem. So it's a really good way of detecting a problem early, and being able to treat that early is key to getting those piglets off to a better start. So just a little bit more on gruel feeding. You can see here the long troughs and the gruel, the kind of consistency that we'd be looking for, and the round troughs that again also would allow them to do that social feeding. Again, some of you may be using similar round little troughs for creep in the farrowing house, and this is sort of just mimicking that again, so again limiting that stress a little bit. And we just feel that gruel feeding several times a day really is worth the effort to get a better quality piglet at this time post-weaning. Also, just a quick note about feed coverage within hoppers. If we're creep feeding solid straight away as well, we don't want to overwhelm our piglets. So we sort of recommend a roughly 40% feed coverage of those hoppers post-weaning rather than filling them straight up. Also, as piglets are still feeding only little and often, as we said, filling those hoppers right up at like that bottom picture there may result in some of that feed going off or becoming very dusty and unpalatable very quickly. And if that happens, then we may be putting the pigs off feeding in that space later on. And also, we're putting very expensive feed into these hoppers generally at this time. So generally it's creep feed. So really, when we've got them full up like that, the piglets often start to nose in them and play with it, and we get more wastage if we do that. So we want to try and avoid that as much as possible. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about intestinal health, gut health, and creep feeding. So just as a little introduction, we're just going to have a look at what the intestine looks like of a pig. So here's a sort of a cross section of the intestine, and you can see these long finger-like projections, of which there's a little schematic to the right. So these long finger-like projections are the piglet's villi, or one of them is called a villus. And these are made up of all these individual intestinal cells. And in the middle, they have a very, very good blood supply. So as food travels down the intestine, the nutrients can be absorbed over these little cells on this projection and straight into the bloodstream. So it's very effective. These villi are so long and thin to provide a larger surface area for nutrient absorption, so making the most of the feed that the piglets eat. However, this changes post-weaning. So as you can see, there's the difference. This is actually an electron photograph of the internal lining of the intestine. On the suckling pigs, you can see these long finger-like projections, whereas on the weaned pig, you can see they're shorter and thicker and stunted. And as you can imagine, this results in a significantly lower surface area for nutrient absorption. So as a result, essentially, they're not using the feed with the same efficiency as they would be with these long finger-like projections. And this is often due to this transition onto this solid feed very quickly. Again, on this graph, you can see that this change in feed and the weaning date has a significant impact on growth rate as a result. So up to suckling, they're gradually increase in the suckling periods, that growth rate is gradually increasing up to about week 4. And then when we're weaning, putting them straight onto dry feed, that significantly decreases. And we want to avoid that. So we want to keep that growth rate line keep going up rather than having that large dip and check in that time. The other thing that the piglets that changes in the piglets throughout their life is their digestive enzymes. So while they're suckling, as you can see here, in the first 3 weeks of life, they have milk digesting enzymes within their guts and very few carbohydrate digesting enzymes. Now, carbohydrate digesting enzymes is what they need to process solid creep feed and absorb nutrients effectively from them. Over time, the milk digesting enzymes decrease and the carbohydrate digesting enzymes increase. However, if we've not introduced creep feed very much in the farrowing house, then that line does not go up as quick. So as in, we don't have as many carbohydrate digesting enzymes in those piglets as quickly over time. As a result, we can help improve this by creep feeding in the farrowing house. And as you can see, the line increases quicker. So we have more of these enzymes available at weaning. So effectively, we are training the gut to that solid feed quicker so they can absorb those nutrients better at that time. So here we have one of the studies done, which just shows you further that there is a significant difference between not feeding creep in the farrowing house compared to feeding creep in the farrowing house to the post-weaning performance. So no creep in the farrowing house resulted in a lower daily gain throughout the weaning period compared to those that were offered creep feed pre-weaning and then ate creep post-weaning. So there's a significant difference. So from less than 500 grams per day on no creep to more than 530 grams per day when they were offered creep in that farrowing house. And that's what we want to be aiming for, really. Similarly here, for this study, you can see there's a significant difference between these two groups. So group 1 were the group which were fed creep from day 7 of age, so in the farrowing house from day 7, compared to group 2, which were fed creep from day 14 of the farrowing house. And there is just almost a 10% difference in the number of pigs which were eating creep post-weaning when they were fed creep earlier in the farrowing house. So many more pigs who were eating creep post-weaning compared to when they were fed creep a week of age compared to 2 weeks of age, if that makes sense. And so why are we really bothered by the growth rate in the weaning period when we can hopefully catch up in the grower and finisher period when they grow like stink? Well, actually, a faster growth rate in those 3 weeks in that particular weaner period has a direct effect on the overall growth rate to slaughter, a significant effect. So as you can see, if they have a lower growth rate in that weaner period, they have an overall much lower growth rate to slaughter compared to those which were growing much faster during that weaning period. So overall, it has a significant effect on growth throughout. So it's really important to try and get it right early on. So what do we require our creep and our starter feeds to have? So I say generally our starter and creep feeds most importantly need to be nice and tasty. So they need to be really palatable to encourage good intake for these weaners. Piglets have roughly 15,000 taste buds. This is about 3 to 4 times as many as humans. So you can imagine it needs to be really tasty to encourage them to keep eating. And they're very sensitive to when it is sour or goes off. Therefore, it also needs to be nice and fresh. It needs to have good quality ingredients. And these should include milk powders and sugar, because obviously they are used to this sugary, milky substance from the sow's milk previously. So we want to encourage intakes and encourage it to be similar to what it was before. So we want to mimic that as much as possible. So starters and creeps also need to be really nice and digestible to avoid any digestive upsets and scours throughout this period. They should contain some cooked cereals for some energy. So this would be things like oats, wheat, corn, maize. It also needs some protein, some whey powder, and it needs some fats, some oils. There generally should be quite a bit of fat in there as well. It needs to be really consistent. It needs to be consistently of good, high quality to ensure continued good performance. We also want it to be of good physical quality, so that means it shouldn't be very dusty. It also needs to be, if pelleted, needs to be not too hard and not too large for the size of the weaner that you're getting. It needs to be really correctly stored, and this is a really important one for everyone, whether you're a small holder or only have a few pigs or a bigger unit. So really often we get our creep feed bagged. Some of you may get it into larger bins, in which case we need to be maintaining the bins really well. But those of you who store it in bags, these should be stored in a cool, dry place. And when you open them, this is even more important, and they need to be used fairly quickly, and the tops need to be sealed as much as possible. So this is particularly important for health reasons, because this, as we said, this creep feed tends to have a lot of fat in it, and fat, when it becomes warm or moist, can go rancid very quickly. And the thing is that in this time, particularly in this growth period, the weaners need a lot of vitamins, which tend to be fat soluble, like vitamin E. That's a really important one for their immunity, so that they may stay healthy. And if the fat goes rancid, then those weaners which cannot make vitamin E internally no longer have a source of vitamin E. And that can result in a really high mortality, unfortunately, which we see on some units. So this is particularly relevant if you're storing your creep in your weaner house, which is often of a high temperature. Maybe we should be thinking about storing it in a slightly cooler, drier place, even if it is the passageway, and sealing those bags. It's really important. And as you can see from the slides, so poor or incorrect choices can result in really reduced performance. Similarly, incorrect storage can result in really reduced performance as a result, and reduced farm income overall. And as you know, a better start would equal a better finish. So I just thought it'd be interesting for you just to see the rough intakes for starter and starter and creep feeds. So here we have on the side, you can see the starter types, the piglet that we would usually be, the diet types, the piglet's age that we would usually be feeding these types of diets to, and then their rough target intake. So that does vary depending on pig health, diet quality, feeding and management skills at that time, but this should be roughly what we would be looking for and hoping for each of these diets if you're using as many of these. And then on the next slide, we should hopefully have a little bit about transition feeders. Yeah, so I don't know if any of you have seen these before. These are quite common in Europe nowadays, but they are present to help transition the weaners from liquid feed or liquid sow milk to solid feed. So essentially meal and water mixed. So they're almost like an automatic gruel machine. And they are used for roughly 12 to date until about 12 to 14 days post weaning to try and get the growth up in this time. They result in increased feed intakes and essentially mean that you don't need to go in and gruel feed all the time. However, they're quite delicate and require really good management skills to use them correctly and require the knowledge. So, but they are being used more widely in Europe now and a really useful bit of equipment coming up. So you may see more coming up in the UK in the future. But here, and just some data just to prove what I'm saying. As you can see, with the transition feeders compared to the dry feeds in the hoppers, there was a significantly higher growth rate throughout that time, and as a result, there was a significantly higher weight at the end of weaning. Interestingly, in the study, they also had a higher mortality and a higher level of health problems, that's morbidity, when the pigs that were fed dry feed over the pigs that had the transition feeder in. I think, however, most probably in this case, those were related to the fact that they had slightly poorer quality pigs because they weren't growing as well and they weren't weighing as much. So as a result, we had that. I'm not entirely sure that it's directly down to the transition feeder that you had a lower, directly down to actual health benefits of the transition feeder, but you just have a more robust pig at the end, I think is the moral. Then just to give you an idea roughly of the different diet types that are around, this is a really rough guide and it does depend on who you buy them from or whether you're mill and mixing yourself. But generally, this is the general cost per ton for these different types of weaner feeds, starting from pre-starter, starter, creep, link, and grower. The cost per ton would go down as you go down the table, but the amount that the pigs will eat of this generally goes up as you go down the table, and as a result, the cost per pig goes up as you go down the table. So as you work your way down the actual diets. But the earlier diets are the more expensive diets. So when we are transitioning between these diets, i.e. from a starter to a creep or from a creep to a link, and the more diets you use, probably the better feed conversion you're getting or the feed efficiency you're getting. But when we're transitioning, we really want to be doing that gradually and not just from one straight to another, as this often results in significant to intestinal problems and diarrhea. So changing gradually would decrease that risk and hopefully also increase your feed efficiency as a result. So we can do this either by mixing both feeds in one hopper or one trough, or you could supply another extra trough when you're adding the new feed in, one of those long troughs, and allow the pigs to start to self-select, and then over time move that feed back into the hopper again. When we're changing from one diet to the next, we should think about the diets and think about using the same raw materials from one to another. So the same raw materials should be the basic raw material should be within the creep and the link to reduce again the digestive upsets from transitioning from one to the next. So now, guys, just for a little bit of audience participation and some information for us, we have just developed a quick poll for you involved with. I hope that you will get involved, and we'll have a little bit of a discussion around this topic as well. So which of the following do you routinely record? Daily live weight gain, feed conversion rate, both daily live weight gain and feed conversion rate, or do you not record any of these? Let us know. Okay, so hopefully you've all voted. Yeah, and hopefully everyone can see this screen. So 15% of you just record daily live weight gain. 10% of you have said you record only feed conversion rates. A good 40% of you have said you record both daily live weight gains and feed conversion rate. And 35% of you say you record neither. That's quite good information for us, and hopefully those of you who don't record either will, we're going to go through what both of those are and how we can calculate them. So maybe you could use them in the future. And for those that do regularly record one or the other, then we're just going to go through the other one and see if that might be useful for you. And for those that you record both already, it's just a little bit of revision quickly. So daily live weight gain. So we shorten that to DLWG, so that's what you'll see in a lot of publications. We're referring to daily live weight gain in that case. And this is simply the amount of weight gained per pig per day over a particular period. So that can be weaned to slaughter, or as we're looking here, just that weaning period. So the way I would calculate that is, from this example, we have a batch of pigs that average 7.3 kilos at weaning at 28 days of age. And we have at 63 days of age, they average 22.4 kilos. So the question is, what is their daily gain? Firstly, we want to calculate how many days the pigs have been in the shed between the two weights being taken. So basically, it's the difference between 63 days and 28 days. So that leaves us a 35-day period in which we're looking at that difference in weight. And then we want to calculate the difference in weight. So that's 22.4, the difference between 22.4 and 7.3, which leaves us with 15.1. So we then divide the weight gained by the number of days it's taken to gain that weight. So simply it's 15.1 divided by 35, which gives us 431 grams per day. So I hope everyone followed that. It's a fairly simple calculation, and you might be able to use that in the future on your own units or farms. So next up is feed conversion rate, and this is a particular useful key performance indicator that we often look at. And this is simply the total feed fed in kilos over the given amount of time, divided by the total weight gain over the given amount of time. So if we just look at an example, this is a slightly bigger calculation and requires a few more steps and generally a little bit more information. So in this example, we have 176 pigs average 7.3 kilos at weaning, which is at 28 days. And then 35 days later, 171 pigs average 22.4 kilos. And these pigs were each fed 2 kilos of starter, 2.5 kilos of creep, 5 kilos of link, and 2,205 kilos of grower in total. And we've lost some pigs, but we've lost them while they've been fed the grower ration. So my first step would then be to calculate the total weight gain, which is the difference, as you can see, between the 171 pigs that average 22.4 kilos and 176 pigs that average 7.3 kilos. So here we have a total weight difference of 2,545.6 kilos. And then we want to calculate the feed fed over that period of time. So over those 35 days, how much feed did we feed these pigs in total? So that's a slightly larger calculation again, because each of the 176 pigs were fed 2 kilos of starter, 2.5 kilos of creep, and 5 kilos of link. So we need to times that out. And then we need to add the 2,205 kilos of grower that they were all fed, so into the total amount that they were fed. So that's a total amount of feed of 3,877 kilos in total. And as they gained 2,518.6 kilos in that time, having been fed 3,877 kilos, we need to divide the two between each other. And you'll hopefully get a feed conversion rate of 1.5. Now, this is a fairly good feed conversion rate if you looked at it over the total time, so from weaning to slaughter, a good FCR is about 2. And the lower the FCR in this case, as it's a ratio or a rate, is essentially better. So the feed conversion rate or ratio is essentially the amount of feed it takes the pig to put 1 kilo of weight on. So, for example, if the FCR is 2, then it takes 2 kilos of feed to take a pig from 30 to 31 kilos of live weight, if that makes sense. So in the weaner period, an FCR of 1.5 is good. It's good. So water is something that we're talking about a lot more nowadays, and we're realizing it's really important to maintain good health for weaners, and it's also really important for us to have a good supply so that we maintain good feed intakes and good growth rates, because pigs that don't drink don't eat. So it's one of the primary things that we need to think about. So with that, we need to think about the surface of the water. So how much trough space we're giving these pigs, or how much space in a river flow, or how many nipples that you're providing to these pigs. We absolutely need to keep it clean during the occupation of the pig. So for you guys that have river flow drinkers or troughs, we should be scraping those out really regularly and replenishing it with clean water as much as possible. Ideally, we would be using a similar water trough or water system to that you have in the farrowing area or farrowing crate. So if you're using a particular type of nipple in the farrowing crate, we would want to use a similar one in the weaner area. Or if you're using a particular bowl or trough in the farrowing house, again, we'd want to use a similar one in the weaner area to reduce the stress of trying to work out where our water is coming from. We also need to think about proximity and layout. So that means, for example, ideally, we want the water to be as close as possible to the feeders for the pigs, because piglets often like to feed and drink at the same time. So that to maintain good intakes, that's really important. Particularly if we're in a straw system or we have kennels in a slatted or straw system, we want to make sure that we have some access to water very close to the kennels, because when the pigs huddle in those kennels to stay warm or in that warm area, we still want them to come out and drink. So that water needs to be really close, so they don't feel like they're getting a real chill when they're coming out of the kennels to drink, and are still encouraged to drink. We need to think about, if we're using nipples, the height of the nipples, and whether we should have adjustable height nipples, so that as they grow, we can lift the height up or lower the height for the smaller pigs in the pen. And thinking about that as well, we need to also think about the height of the troughs and the height of the river flows, because many times I see the normal river flows that we would be using for growers and finishers in our weaner pens, and our weaners cannot actually reach those physically. And I see them often getting into those troughs. So that's poor, and we want to avoid that, particularly at this time of year. So really, we need to make sure that the height is lowered, or we have some sort of step system so they can actually, the smallest pigs in the pen can still reach those troughs and those river flows. Also, just thinking about it, at this time of year, we need to make sure that our pipes are regularly maintained and defrosted regularly, and that we're not having lots of ice on our troughs, so that we have a continuous supply of water to our weaners. Some people acidify their water for many reasons, but one of which to encourage a higher intake. Flow rates, if we're using nipples, should be checked regularly and they need to be appropriate for weaners. We're going to go over good flow rates for weaners in just a little bit. And ideally, whether you're using troughs, river flows, or nipples, we should be cleaning and disinfecting the lines and the actual troughs if you have them between batches or between lists. So here we go, as I promised, we're just going to go through some flow rates. You can see the ideal flow rates for lots of different weights of pigs. As you go down, they get bigger. Our weaners obviously are in the 7 to 18 kilo section, and the flow rates for nipple drinkers should be around 0.3 litres a minute. They certainly shouldn't be any lower than this, particularly if you have smalls in the pen. However, you also don't want it to be much higher than this, because too high pressure in this time might put those pigs off drinking. So we do want it to be almost exactly 0.3. And as they grow, you can lift it up a little bit. So as they get to 19 kilos, you can see the range starts on 0.5 litres. The 7 to 18, it can sort of be upwards to 0.4 litres a minute when they're getting to that upper weight range. But certainly when they're coming in, we want it to be around 0.3 litres a minute. So when using nipple drinkers, we need to be allowing roughly 1 nipple drinker per 10 to 15 pigs. The range is for the difference between a red tractor requirement and a freedom foods requirement, but obviously really 1 nipple per 10 pigs is the most ideal, as that means you're going to get hopefully a higher water intake and therefore higher feed intake for the pigs. Extra drinkers are a really good idea in our weaner pens, certainly. If we're using bowl drinkers, 1 bowl drinker for 20 to 30 pigs. Drinker heights, as we said before, need to be adjusted as the pigs grow, or we need to have catered for them somehow, other nipples at different heights as the pigs grow. And we need to be having nipples or drinker heights low enough for the smallest pigs in the pen as well at the same time. So here we have just a couple of different types of water supply. You can see an ad-lib wet feeder in this pen. So that's going to be where some of the piglets are getting their water supply from. But they also have the nipple drinkers there, and they have the extra turkey drinkers. So I really like these turkey drinkers. You can supply acidified water through them, or just normal water, or you can sometimes supply electrolytes through them. But they are great when you first wean into a pen for the first week or so. Just provide those piglets with extra flowing water, and it can be lifted up as you get to the 2nd or 3rd week of them being in that pen and getting them used to those nipple drinkers. And as you can see in the lower ones, the lower pictures, there's just an adjustable drinker height there. As you can see, they're on a spring, so you can adjust them upwards. And different types of nipples on the picture on the left there, as well as the bowl drinker. Again, here are some alternative drinker layouts. Again, you could use some get the drinkers with the sidebars. This prevents the piglets playing with the nipples so much, so reducing wastage. Often more interesting in slurry-based systems. Again, on the right, you can see nipples in a row, but placed so that they're just slanted, so that we're catering for different sizes of pigs within a pen. If we size our pigs into the pen, however, as we talked about before, we should be able to have them all at one height and adjust them only as they grow upwards, hopefully. So just a little quick word on acidification of water for weaners. So quite a lot more producers are doing this, and we're just going to go through why they're doing this. So pre-weaning, the piglets are digesting milk, and as a result of this digestion of the milk, they are forming lactic acid within the gut. And this lactic acid, being an acid, lowers the pH of the gut itself. Once we wean that piglet quite quickly, especially if we're weaning a little bit younger at about 3 or 4 weeks, then we are removing that milk digestion, and as we said, those milk digesting enzymes are decreasing, and we still don't have those carbohydrate digesting enzymes yet. And as we are not digesting the milk anymore, we don't have so many, well, the piglets don't have so much lactic acid. Therefore, they generally have a higher gut pH than the suckling piglets. When the gut has a higher pH, it's generally a better environment for bacteria to grow. And that's something we don't want to happen, because these bacteria often cause these post-weaning scours that we see, or post-weaning diarrhea that we might see. So acidification of the water essentially brings that gut pH back down again. Now, when I say acidification, we don't want to go too low, and we need to definitely check the pH of the water regularly, that we are trying to acidify, and we don't want to go any lower than a pH of 4. Acidification essentially helps kill off some of the bacteria in the gut, the nasty bacteria in the gut. And actually, because the pigs like to drink this acidified water a little bit more, it's more palatable, they often have increased water intake. And sometimes, or very often, increased water intake leads to continued increased feed intake, which is excellent in the weaner period. We tend to use a mixture of organic acids, sometimes lactic and formic acids, but more as well. Now, in order to dose acid through the water, we do need a metering device, so it needs to be an acid-resistant dosatron or a select doser, and you need to have the pipework and the water pipework to withstand that acid corrosion. So it needs to be either plastic throughout or stainless steel. We would do it up to about 3 weeks post-weaning. It's historically particularly good for salmonella, and often reduces the need for antibiotics in this time, which is important. Some people, interestingly, are now also using some acid feed additives for their creep feed. There are different ones available, and they often do this through their nutritionists or through the mills. So this can be done instead of acidifying water. I wouldn't recommend doing both, but if you're doing the water, the key to remember is a pH of no less than 4, or you can try and add an acid to the feed. So, enrichment. Again, another stressor, as we said, was that mixing and grouping and creating those new hierarchies. We're also stocking them heavier than they would have been in the farrowing house. So to try and avoid excessive biting, and to try and avoid excessive vice, so tail biting, ear biting, potentially flank biting, although slightly less at this age. We need to provide lots of enrichment, so lots of playthings. Now, we have had some new welfare guidance recently, and this states that playthings for the piglets need to be all of these things at once. So they need to be edible, chewable, manipulable, investigable, and destructible all at once. Straw is considered optimal by DEFRA, so all of you using straw weaner-based systems have an optimal enrichment already built in. Other materials, generally, there's a big table which you can have a look on and the welfare codes, but generally other materials are suboptimal. But you can use suboptimal materials, but you have to use more than one. So suboptimal materials would include things like shavings, shredded paper, and compressed straw briquettes. But if you're using them, like I said, you would have to use more than one suboptimal material to can. Other materials that we regularly use that you can see in this picture, like chains and plastic and hard wood, these are classed as materials of marginal interest. So although they can be used for the piglets, and often the piglets do play with them, they are not considered good and need to be combined with either an optimal material like straw or multiple suboptimal materials. So on this slide, you can see some extra enrichment types. So in Denmark, they're using a lot of these chopped straw hoppers that are just slowly feeding that straw through and allow the piglets at the bottom. There's no piglets at the bottom, sadly, but they forage for that straw as well itself. So it's nice to play with, and it helps on a slatted based system. If your flats are not supporting putting full length straw in, this can be an option. Chains are, as we said, are material of marginal interest and considered boring for pigs, even though we do see them playing with them quite often. We can leave them in the pens, but they're not count. They basically don't count on their own. Wood can be good, and wood is fine if it can be chewed at properly, but if hardwood is used, that would also be considered marginal interest rather than suboptimal. And if you are using wood, it's very important to make sure that it's non-tannalized wood and non-treated wood. So it can't be old fence posts, etc. It needs to be suitable for pigs. And the same if you're using paper shavings or shredded paper, the ink needs to be vegetable based and non-toxic for pigs. So temperature, this is another stressor, as we labelled before, a new temperature going into the new environment of the weaner shed. So we want to try and reduce the stress as much as possible. So I always say pigs will often tell you if they're feeling too hot and too cold. So like in this picture, pigs which huddle on top of one another are generally too cold, or they have a particularly drafty area of the pen in which they don't want to lie. So they're not using that area of the pen to lie in because there's a draft. Pigs that, however, lie on their side and well away from one another generally are showing you that they are too warm. Interestingly, dunging pattern is also an indicator of thermal comfort for pigs and changes when they're too hot and too cold. Generally, pigs will dung in the coldest area of the pen. As I'm sure you're aware, this is often the outer wall or something where they're under a window or one of the big stone walls next to there. However, when they get too hot, they start dunging in other areas of the pen, and often this can result in dunging everywhere and anywhere. And then they tend to wallow in that dung as well to try and cool down. So that's a good indicator that your pigs are getting too warm. So pigs have something called critical temperatures and a thermoneutral zone in which we want to keep them. So our thermoneutral zone is the zone in between these upper critical temperatures above which the pigs are too hot and the lower critical temperature below which the pigs are too cold. And as those pigs grow in weight or get bigger, they essentially have a wider range in which they are comfortable. But at weaning, they suddenly have a much smaller range again compared to what they did at the end of the last days in their farrowing house, because they have those other stressors. This is just illustrating again the difference between the upper critical temperature, lower critical temperature, and the thermoneutral or the comfort zone. So the upper critical temperature, when the pigs are too hot, they do things like pant, or they create dirty areas with their dung, or with dung all over the pen, and then start to wallow in that to try and cool down. They also lie away from each other, and obviously also they don't want to expend as much energy, they don't want to move, so they eat less food and the growth rate declines. In the comfort zone, the pigs are lying next to each other nicely but not huddled, often lying on their fronts rather than on their sides laid out, and have hopefully optimal performance. Below the lower critical temperature, the pigs are cold. Often you see them becoming slightly hairier. They huddle in a heap. As a result, their feed efficiency decreases because they're using all that energy for warmth rather than for growth, and their growth rate drops as well. And pigs that are too cold are more susceptible to new diseases. And as we said before, pigs that are too cold in that heat then don't want to get out of that heat to eat. So again, they actually have a lower feed intake as well. So what temperatures pigs require depends on many factors. One of them is housing. So the floor type, the type of insulation of your shed, the group size, the weaning weight, the type of ventilation, natural versus fan-assisted, the pen layout, and the heating system. So many of those things will influence what temperature they actually need. Also, their current feed intake influences the temperature they need. So if they're on a really good high feed intake, they don't need as high a temperature. If they're in really good health, they don't need as high a temperature. And other stressors, like the amount of handling, the group size, as we've said above, and other stressors will influence the temperature that they actually need. So when do pigs require a higher temperature? So shortly post-weaning, we need a higher temperature. So even than what we are running the farrowing houses at by that time, or running the farrowing area at by that time, because at weaning, this is a very large stressor, as we said before, the actual process taken away from the mum. And we want to encourage them to explore their new pen really quickly and find those new feed places and new water drinkers very, very quickly. And that's really important, and find the lying area. And they need a high temperature to do that. Slatted accommodation overall needs to run at a higher temperature compared to straw-based accommodation, because the straw itself is bedding and provides some degree of warmth. And also often on the straw-based systems, we have some sort of kennel area or creep area still, which allows a particular warm area within the pen or within the shed, rather than having a very open system and needing the whole pen and the whole shed to be one temperature. Piglets or pens which we have a lower stocking density, for example, hospital pens, or just if we have a lower stocking density in general, less pigs around, then we need a higher temperature in that area. And again, a kennel in those particular pens may be necessary. Also, when we're in a small pen compared to in the larges, we may need to run that pen or that shed, if you've got a small shed, slightly higher than the larges. Also, when there's a draft, lots of air speed, then we need a higher temperature generally. So for the guys that have straw bedding, if it's particularly cool or particularly windy or particularly stormy, then we might need to think about bedding up more, so having more straw around. Again, making more of a kennel, making that kennel nice and cozy, putting some tarpaulin at the front as well, so that it really keeps that heat in nicely. Also, when pigs are ill, they need a higher temperature. So as you all know, when you go to hospital or A&E or any of the hospital, or if you're visiting relatives in hospital, you often go in and the heat hits you, because ill people, and similarly ill piglets, need a higher temperature compared to normal. When you're fighting illness, you want to use all your energy to fight the illness and not to be keeping warm at the same time. So this is a guide only, because it does depend on your system, and I'm aware that we have probably quite a wide range of people listening in today with very different systems. So the pigs will actually tell you that if they're in thermal comfort, like we said, are they eating, how are they lying, how are they doing? So that will tell you, give you a good feeling of whether you're running your sheds too hot or too cold, or whether they're just right. Generally, I would say we want to be around 28 to 30 degrees, so at that higher end of towards 30 on the day of weaning for a day or two, until they're eating really well. And then we can reduce it to 27 degrees by about day 5, so gradually reduce that, very, very gradually, not more than 1 to 1.5 degrees a week over that time, and definitely not more than a degree a day. And then maybe we can reduce it to roughly 23 degrees by 20 kilos. So if you're in a straw-based system, or using kennels and having that nice warm area, or a creep area, or a feeding area, then we can get away with a slightly lower temperature to begin with, around 25 degrees, and lowering that down to 23 degrees over time. Sorry, and I just didn't say on that last slide, it's really important, if you do have a kennel area in your shed, that in your weaner shed, that you are staring at those pigs and making sure they are coming out of that kennel to feed and drink regularly. So ideally more than once a day, so that we still have those intakes, because they will preferentially sit and lie in those. Okay, and just one quick slide on ventilation and drafts, as I am no expert on ventilation. It is really important to remember a little bit that this really does influence the quality of the weaners. So ventilation overall is about changing of air and air movement, and it is essential that we have adequate ventilation in a shed to avoid high humidity and high ammonia levels. Pigs absolutely hate being in drafts, but they are also very easily affected by gases like ammonia. Reduced air exchange can lead to buildup of these gases, and that can lead to respiratory problems like pneumonias, so sniffling pigs and coughing pigs and just illness in general. So it is a really fine balance between maintaining good air circulation in the sheds, but similarly avoiding chilling of those weaners. If you suspect your ventilation is limiting or lacking in certain areas by looking at the lying pattern of your pigs, then I would suggest that you look for some expert advice. And some things that you can do, or some devices that you can use, is smoke bombs to just identify where your drafts are or how your ventilation is actually functioning in your sheds. So we're just going to home in on smaller pigs quickly, because I think that they just are the pigs that need a little bit more TLC over time. So smaller pigs need more care and attention generally, as they produce less heat, they eat less food overall. As a result, they're also more prone to disease. And if your sizing is not as good as it could be, then they often are bullied out by those bigger pigs. So again, it's a vicious circle. Then they eat less food, again are more prone to disease, produce less heat. So it's a vicious circle for these pigs. So to help combat these things, we can run the sheds warmer, or provide more bedding, so more straw, or have a specific kennelled area if you don't already. So provide a little straw den for them to get in, to just have that warm area for them, so they don't spend so much energy keeping warm. We can try and feed them the better diets longer, so not move on to for example, from the creep to the link as quickly. So give them a little bit longer on that better creep diet, and feeding them something like gruel for longer alongside the creep, so that we continue to have that intake. We can think about acidifying the water or the feed, as we've already said. Providing additional troughs for water for food, and things like turkey drinkers for water. That would apply to both straw sheds and slatted sheds. We want to be in the sheds as often as we can be, to try and make sure that we're staring at the pigs so that they're eating, but obviously this needs to be done in a calm way as much as possible. We want to ensure that the feeders and the drinkers are close to the kennel or lying areas, so that we're still encouraging intakes even when it's cooler. And this is especially, again, important in straw yards or straw sheds. If we can, we should ensure that, again, they're penned separately from the larger pigs, so there's less competition. And for example, even if your larger pigs are starting to grow apart a little bit, or your mediums are not, and you're seeing some pigs become smaller, then we want to be removing those small pigs and putting them into a separate pen together, so that they have more of a chance to catch up. We really just want to regularly assess the health of the pigs, so regularly go through the pigs, making sure that there's no actual illness of any kind, and if there is, make sure that we're medicating quickly and efficiently. So that just brings us on to to a little bit about health, which is obviously my key area. So health can be the most important limiting factor to feed intake for weaners. So it can be the most limiting factor for weaner performance generally. Any disease challenge, whether the pig actually becomes clinically unwell or not, will result in an immune response. And any immune response that the pig mounts takes energy, so decreases the likelihood of good growth and performance. So as a result, basically, we want to try and avoid this as possible. Health status, when health status falls, feed and water intakes drop in turn, and this again results in decreased growth rates and reduced profitability overall. We want to therefore ensure that routine treatments such as vaccination are done well and in accordance with the farm vet's advice, and that they are given, if possible, pre-weaning to prevent diseases at weaning, so in the farrowing house, or potentially within the weaning period to prevent diseases later on if it's necessary. And if you're having to treat individual pigs for particular ailments, this should be done with the correct dose, in the correct way, and at the right time. And in addition to that, I'm just going to add a little bit to say that if we're treating with particular medications or we're using vaccinations, then we should be double checking how those vaccinations and medications need to be stored. They need to be stored in accordance with the label, otherwise they may actually not work or be inactivated. So that's a really important point there as well. So I'm just going to mention a few really broad signs of ill health, nothing too specific. We're not going to go into specific diseases. If you're interested, you can always drop some questions in or an email asking more specifics. But broadly, we should be looking for discharges, particularly from the snouts and the eyes, that might be creamy or off colour in general. Some tear staining, darker tear staining that we can see around the pig's eyes that can indicate a challenge, a viral challenge, or signs of general respiratory disease. Breathing rate should be observed, and if there's blowing or heaving when the pigs are really struggling or panting, that can be a sign of a pneumonia that might need treating. Coughing, sneezing may also be signs of pneumonia that would probably need treating fairly swiftly. We should be looking at the skin. It should not be too pale and it should not be hairy. So hairiness may be an indicator of pigs having been too cold, but it can also just be an indicator that those are doing poorly. So the body condition may again be very small as well. So we need to think about body condition as well. The other thing to think about with skin is making sure that there's no rashes or red diamond-like lesions on the skin of the pigs, as these could indicate disease as well. And if you're seeing any of these, then we want to be ringing your vets. Lameness is another one that we should be looking out for. So are they able to walk well? Do they have swelling of any joints? Or are they looking like very stiff or very shuffly, in which case they may need treatment. So scour, this is something that we call diarrhea for anyone who doesn't know. And this, we might see this in this, you might see this on the slats very easily. In straw, it can be slightly harder to detect sometimes, but you might see a lot of piglets with really red and wet back ends, and piglets that are going backwards and are becoming very thin very quickly. These are often the scouring piglets that we need to look out for and treat. And generally, when we're walking around the pen, we want bright and alert piglets. So if they are very dull and not very responsive, or all creeping in their kennels, that can be an indicator that there's something wrong generally. The other thing, like we mentioned before, we want to be checking their feed intakes and hopefully their water intakes as well, and making sure that they are at normal. And if you're seeing dips in those, again, that might be a key first indicator to there being a health challenge within the pigs. And when we're seeing any of these problems, we want to take quick corrective action. So the ways to medicate pigs can be either to give an injection into the muscle. This is probably mostly for individual pigs. If we have more of a group problem, then it may be necessary to water medicate if your water system allows it, or to put some medication in the feed. All of these should be considered in discussion with your own farm vets. So as I mentioned, all the principles that we've discussed, the stressors, etc., apply to a straw-based system, to smallholders, as well as specialist factors. Although any smallholders listening would have slightly less stressors in terms of mixing litters, etc., often, and may see the benefit there generally over the larger producers. And I just wanted to add extra that Weaner records are really important generally. It helps us assess, it would help you, the farmers, assess the profitability of the unit, and it allows targeted intervention for the weaners when we record it down to individual sections. So having a weaner section just by itself, and allows improvements to be made. And we can also then see whether those things that we've changed have actually made a difference to that particular section more quickly, as if we were recording over a longer wean to slaughter period. So if we have good measurements just in the weaner period, we can make quicker differences there, essentially. And routine medication and general medication usage recording is a requirement for red tractor, and generally anyway. So to summarize, to establish our weaner as much as possible, firstly we should be cleaning and disinfecting the houses between batches or between litters, however you're doing it, or certainly between different pigs in those pens. Ideally, we would wean later, as the older ages are just slightly more robust. This may not be economically viable for some of you, but some of you may be able to consider this. We want to wean heavier pigs, so that includes focusing on a better birth weight, potentially sound milk output, number of pigs per litter, peak feeding in the farrowing house, hygiene, stewardship and management in the farrowing house as well. So that's really important, as it has a massive influence on weaning before we've even started to get the pigs there. We want to get the piglets accustomed to eating creep feed in that farrowing house, particularly to help develop those digestive enzymes and reduce that villus damage that we showed you. So basically, have a better gut for the pigs to digest that solid feed quickly and have better performance as a result. Ideally, we would pre-warm any slatted sheds for at least 24 hours before putting weaners in, so increasing the temperature even relative to the farrowing house. Or if you have straw sheds or straw-based systems, then we need to set up nice warm kennel areas before the weaners are put in. Providing extra trough space and extra drinkers to help reduce the competition and hopefully improve intakes overall, and particularly allowing social drinkers and social troughs so that they can drink and eat at the same time would be great, particularly at the beginning of a weaner period. If you're using nipple drinkers, then checking drinker flow rates to ensure they're in that right range and they're not over pressurized, but also not under pressurized, as pigs won't stand and drink for very long. We need to ensure we're providing a draft-free, comfortable lying area, regardless of whether we're having straw or a slatted building. We should be setting the temperatures to suit our systems individually, and gradually reduce those temperatures by 1.5 to 2 degrees a week at the very most, and can get it down to 23 to 21 degrees by the end of weaning. So close, depending on other factors, as we talked about. We want to provide fresh, palatable, good quality feed, and offer it 3 to 4 times a day initially. This may be in the form of gruel feeding initially in the first week, and then offer creep ad lib in the hoppers, which is of very good quality, hopefully. If we're transitioning between different feeds, we want to do that gradually. We want to provide good enrichment in all the sheds in line with the new DEFRA welfare codes, and to help the pigs settle into their new pens. We want to observe signs of ill health every day and take quick corrective action if necessary. And overall, keep good records so that any improvements that we make, we can see the impact of quickly. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Right. Thank you ever so much for that, Christina. We've had quite a few questions come through actually, and we haven't got an awful lot of time, but we will pop some over to you. So I've got one here. Would you recommend feeding creep for outside farrowed piglets? And I guess this is before pre-weaning.
Sorry, did you say that for pre-weaning?
Yes, yeah. For outdoor piglets.
I mean, if we can feed them and start to feed them pre-weaning, if that's actually physically possible, then yes, as we said, that you can see the benefits of creep feeding in that suckling period is massive. but sometimes it's not practical. So it does really depend on your individual systems. In an ideal world, then if we're looking ideally, then yes, but otherwise we have to think of practical ways. We might start with gruel feeding post weaning then.
Lovely. Next one is, what would your ideal feed intake be in week 1 post weaning?
Well, again, it will really depend on what feed you're feeding. So whether you're using a starter, or a pre-starter, a starter, or a creep in that time. We just have a little table of intakes. So those would be my target intakes. And again, it depends on what you're doing in that first week. But if we can we go back to that slide or not?
Oh, we can, but I think I'd have to go back through the lot. 1 second. I might have to end.
I just had those
the
targets on there, didn't I? To show. Depending on what feed you were on.
Am I too?
So,
is it this one?
Yeah, that's the one I was meaning. So that sort of I hope that sort of answers some of your question, at least in terms of our targets. They'll be lower than that. That's an over the overall period. But our starter and our creep would probably only be fed in those early days. So it probably is around well, maximum 200.
Okay, lovely. So we've got one here around the health and welfare of piglets. Would you also advise that the sow's feeding and health also has a big impact on the health and welfare of the piglets? And do you have any comment in relation to this on maternal microbial imprinting?
Sorry, was that the sows in the farrowing house? I'm struggling to hear you.
Oh, sorry. Yes,
It
that
might be
was,
my
yeah.
computer. Is that the sows in the farrowing house, the feeding? So if it's the feeding of the sows in the farrowing house, then yes, it does have a massive impact, but mainly on the fact that it's going to impact the weaner weight that you get out of your farrowing house. So we need to feed our sows really well so they're milking really well for the weaners.
Lovely. And it was about can you hear me now? Sorry.
Yeah.
It was about the maternal microbial imprinting.
Right.
Whether the health of the cell will imprint onto the piglets.
Yeah, it does to a degree. Obviously, whatever the sow is shedding as such will have an impact on what the piglets have. Well, it's basically what the piglets have been exposed to, and even what the sow is shedding in her feces does affect the type of bugs that is populated in the piglet's gut. Even yes, it does have a large effect. And that's why we talk about the farrowing house a little bit about managing the difference between managing gilts and older parietes, etc., and the importance there. So yeah, that does have an impact as well. But basically, we want to set each of the piglets up as well as we can for weaning in that from farrowing into that weaner period.
Lovely. Just one more that we've only got time for, I'm afraid, is surely the plastic balls on strings have a risk of choking, and I think that this was in relation to the slide that you showed, Christina, and I think they were on a spring, was it?
Yeah, they're on a spring, so they are actually fastened to the slats and can be used, and they're literally on a spring. They can't chew them off. They can chew them over time, but they're quite hard plastic, and they essentially just nose them and nudge them. It's a way for them to manipulate their enrichment. It's not very regularly used. It's more seen generally in Europe. It's on one of the slides. But it was just an example of the different types of enrichment that you can get for pigs. Again, the plastic balls on the spring would be classed as materials of marginal interest, as they're not actually technically edible, you know, but they are investigable, so it does match some of the criteria at least.
We've also got the web hat online actually that AHDB have created that can go through all of the enrichment and how that can affect your vice, and it's a very effective tool actually on that. So if you need any more information, then do let me know and I can signpost you there. So yes, so thank you ever so much again for that, Christina. Just as a bit of a next steps, any questions that weren't answered, we will attach to the recording, so they will be available there along with the ones that we have been able to answer. So just here we've got, if you do have any questions, whether or not it's for the one just gone or for the one coming up, which is growing and finishing, which is next, or topic requests, then do get in contact with me. My information's on there now. So like we said, the next one in the series is the growing and finishing, and that is 2 weeks yesterday, so that's Tuesday the 24th of November. The recordings can be found on our event archive online, and can also be found on the Small Scale Pig Keeping page and the BPA website. And I think the last bit's really important. So telling us how you found the webinar today, you know, whether or not you found it relevant. It's really important that we get that information back from you to make sure that we're doing it right. So you will be signposted to the feedback form straight from here after you've finished on the webinar, but you'll also receive it in an email with a link to the webinar recording between 24 and 48 hours after we finish here, and you also have the opportunity to ask questions on the feedback form. So yeah, thank you ever so much for joining us this evening. I hope everybody keeps safe and well, and thank you again, Christina. It's been great. Take care, everybody.